And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode, the last episode of this season, is titled Memorials Are Blunt Instruments, Commemoration at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and Beyond. I'm joined by Professor Kristen Haas. Professor is an Associate Professor of American Culture and the Coordinator for the Humanities Collaboratory at the University of Michigan. Today is May the 5th, 2022. Everybody, welcome to tonight's episode, the last of the 2021-22 season. As a teacher, as an educator for my entire life, it's always sort of odd to feel the calendar flip and the rhythm of the academic year turn to spring and then to summer. And it's a little bittersweet to have tonight's session, that kind of last day of school feeling, which if you could bottle for those of us not still in the classroom, I would pay a lot of money to still feel. On behalf of my staff, Jira and Mike and Meredith, I want to thank you for your ongoing and continued interest and support. I find your attendance and your participation and contributions to be a reminder that what I hope is very relevant and meaningful professional development and community that we're creating. One of the things that Jira, Mike, and Meredith and I all have in common is having spent many years in the classroom. And so we have an educator's worldview, and it's absolutely our belief, and I think it's embedded in all of the work that we do, that we want to use our platform to amplify and support and enhance the skills of professional educators so that they can become leaders, they can find their agency and their efficacy, and particularly now when the world is turning on a dime, that you feel confident in the material that you're sharing and the work that you do. In particular, as I look around the room tonight, I want to thank several people who are both new faces, or at least new names on my screen, and also some returning veterans to our webinar series. It's wonderful to see Rebecca here tonight. Rebecca's from Red Rock School District in Texas. Kathleen's from Michigan. Linda from New Mexico. Histari from Pennsylvania. Liliana from New Jersey. It's great to see the geography covered. Pamela's joining us tonight from the southernmost part of Georgia. Emily from Columbia, Maryland, just outside of the DMV and DC. Osana is here from Illinois. Hey, Brooke Covington, always great to have you here. Brooke is at Christopher Newport University in Tidewater, Virginia, and Whitney is here from Brigham Young University. It's nice to see such a wide and diverse landscape of educators represented. As always, we have a lot of Los Angeles folks with us. My daughter graduates from college at University of North Carolina this weekend, and she'll be moving to Los Angeles and living down in the Silver Lake area within 2 weeks. So I expect all of you to be on the watch out for her as she makes that transition. Maritza, April, Nancy, it's always great to see you in Griffith Park. William at the Apperson Street Elementary School, and Ulysses, it's great to see you back. And while all of you are equally important to this, I have to give Meg a particular welcome and introduction. Meg is joining us from Brazil tonight, and I do appreciate you joining us from that long distance international Wi-Fi lines, the Wi-Fi as they might call it there. In addition to the staff that I have introduced you to, I also want to take this moment to thank our Teacher Advisory Council for their ongoing work over the last year. Just like all of you, this year has been disrupted in many ways, both on the surface and deep underneath that surface. And their ongoing contributions have really been meaningful as we've continued to find ways to improve and fine-tune the work that we offer K-12 educators. We are currently reviewing what has turned out to be a record pool of applications for next year's council. And I hope that some of you in the room tonight will be a part of that pool. If not, I hope all of you consider joining our Teacher Advisory Council at some point in the future. The center is located in Durham, North Carolina. It is very slowly turning to that sticky summer that central North Carolina, the Triangle area, is known for. Our fellows will be leaving the center in another week and a half or so after completing their fellowship year in person. They've been working on research in a wide variety of disciplines and topics, and these are fellows that I continue to work with and talk with about ways they can support our education work. One of the big changes I've seen in working in this space in the last 25 years after leaving the classroom is the genuine, authentic interest in from academics and scholars at the university level to work collegially with teachers, to share their expertise and to learn from educators from their expertise. And so I do hope that you keep track of the fellows and the work that they do, and will continue to note and cite them as they contribute to our work moving forward. A lot of that work can be found in the Humanities in Class Digital Library. This is a free and open site in which you can both access and publish scholarly and instructional materials. This is a place where you can trust the high quality of the scholarship. You can trust that the instructional materials you find will be open, therefore able to be remixed and to use in your classroom. This is also where we put all of the materials that are associated with our evening webinars. Tonight, Professor Haas has been gracious enough to curate several resources that will be supportive of her work. It could be that you spent time with them in advance. If not, I encourage you to take a look at these articles and viewings after tonight's session so you can continue to explore ways that you can bring tonight's content to your classroom. I'm also very pleased that this site and the work that we do enables us to collaborate and partner with many wonderful organizations that also support humanities education at all levels. I was privileged to be on the North Carolina Council for the Social Studies Board, as well as the National Council for the Social Studies Board. And tonight, I want to welcome back Executive Director Larry Paska, as he shares a little bit about the NCSS work, and in particular, the way that they're supporting and sponsoring tonight's webinar. Hey, Larry, can you hear me up in the DC area?
I sure can. Can you hear me?
I sure can. Thank you. And please tell us more about the good work that NCSS does.
Excellent. Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to see so many of your names on the audience chat. A lot of folks from California, wonderful to see. I want to just first of all start off by acknowledging Teacher Appreciation Week. Thank you so much for what you have done this year to make social studies, make history, humanities education come alive in your classrooms. Social studies certainly has been at the forefront of the news. We all know that, but it is through your hard efforts, through your hard work, through continuing to pivot, to innovate, as we try to move beyond the pandemic into perhaps a new normal for schooling, but certainly trying to make schooling the best it can be. Thank you. I can't thank you enough on behalf of NCSS for all you are doing. And I hope that tonight's webinar is inspiration for you as your school year is either winding down or in some parts of the country still moving forward for at least another month or so. I wanted to share with you just a little bit about our support for this program. And this program for us is important because we are part of a wider group called the Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium. This is a project of the Library of Congress. And some of you may actually have heard of the Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium. You may have actually benefited from grant funding or been part of projects before connected with this work. At NCSS, we are using our TPS participation to develop methods texts, online methods texts at elementary and secondary level that are focused on inquiry in teaching with primary sources. But one of the things I really love about our project is that we get to support webinars like this, where the whole goal is to talk about primary and secondary sources, talk about different spaces where history, humanities, where social studies learning come alive. So that's why I'm really excited again for tonight's webinar, because we're talking about those outdoor spaces and the ways in which we commemorate and have memorialized over time. And that obviously is part of inquiry too, because one of the challenges we know with our kids is when we take informed action, we think about what is it that we choose to memorialize, commemorate in society. So our project, just like so much of what we do in social studies, and especially seeing a lot of you from California, where you're a state that does build the C3 framework into your curriculum and instruction, I just wanted to introduce you briefly to what inquiry means to us at NCSS. It means starting off with developing questions and planning inquiries, helping your students to ask and answer compelling questions about the world around them. We base those questions, we anchor those questions in specific disciplinary concepts, areas of study, like civics, economics, geography, history. Much of what you're learning tonight, of course, is grounded in history, but may also be rooted in geography and civic learning and economic understanding. Dimension 3 is about evaluating sources and using evidence. So what sources of information do we take and use to help answer our questions? What are sources across the disciplines of civics, economics, geography, history, psychology, sociology, and others? Our last dimension in the inquiry arc is about communicating conclusions and taking informed action. What I love about this dimension is it's helping us to think about inquiry not as an act of writing necessarily a 5-paragraph paper, but thinking about the other ways as well in which we might demonstrate our understanding and our answering of the compelling questions we ask in social studies. How do we use media? How do we use memorials? How do we use other forms of technology to share what we've learned? And then what is the process for taking informed action? What kind of inspiration do we as learners have going out into the world to be actively engaged in this question? So I just share this. Many of you may already be familiar with the C3 inquiry arc, but if you're not familiar with it, know that it's kind of the underpinning of how we look at social studies education at NCSS. Well, just as you're here tonight online, I want to share with you some exciting news that we are bringing our social studies community back together in person in just 7 months. We invite all of you, especially those of you I know who are from LA this evening. If you want to fly cross country, we welcome you to Philadelphia, December 2nd through 4th for our 102nd annual conference. Our theme is Revolutionary Ideas and Actions Change the World. We are looking again at the critical role that inquiry-informed action play in social education. Our registration is now open at socialstudies.org/conference. Please join us. Come register now if you'd like. We welcome you back together again in person in Philadelphia. We also, related to this project I've been describing, are hosting a free summer institute in person in Minneapolis next month. If you are a methods professor or you work in training teachers, either teacher candidates or those new in the profession, we welcome you to our summer institute. It's completely free. Methods professors actually receive a stipend to honor their time and commitments to travel. And the purpose of the institute is to spend 2 days constructing curriculum inquiries based on our upcoming methods texts. So I encourage you to learn more. Again, visit us at socialstudies.org to learn more about this institute. Registration is still open for it. And again, this is free for all, and there is a stipend available to methods professors who are interested in coming. I invite you to learn much more about us at NCSS. If you've been with us before, welcome again. Pleased to have you in our network. If you've not been with us for a while, we welcome you back in and hope you'll join us. More information on the C3 framework is at socialstudies.org/C3. If you'd like to become a member again or consider the benefits of membership, we invite you to check us out there as well. Email us anytime with questions or concerns. And of course, do follow us on Twitter for the latest updates in social studies education. In the meantime, have a great webinar tonight. Thank you again for being here this evening, for being a part of this really awesome presentation we're about to have. And I hope to see you in Philadelphia, Minneapolis, or at the very least online through our programming in the coming year. And again, thank you again to the National Humanities Center. Is a true highlight on weekday evenings this whole year to be a part of this series and to learn from scholars and to be a part of this learning with you. So thank you again for hosting these wonderful programs.
Thanks, Larry, and kudos to NCSS and all the good work that you do. So even though this is the end of our webinar series, you may still be interested in professional development with the center. I want to remind you that we are accepting applications to the Teaching African American Studies Summer Institute. We're hosting in Durham, North Carolina this coming July until next Friday. This 5-day institute will give you a chance to work with past fellows and other scholars on the origin story of Black Studies and African American Studies. This is the first of 6 institutes that we'll be offering over the next 3 years in partnership with HBCU Prairie View A&M University located in Houston. This institute does come with a stipend as well as all travel covered, and I hope that you will consider applying and or sharing this with your colleagues. As you know, tonight's webinar does require your participation, and as the last one, I hope I hear a lot of questions from you guys. Please use the audience chat to continue to share thoughts, but also use the Ask the Professor tab to submit more formal questions, and I'll bring those to Professor Haas when the time seems appropriate. Once again, you have joined the Humanities Class webinar series for tonight's session titled Memorial Are Blunt Instruments, Commemoration at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and Beyond. We're being joined by Kristen Haas. Kristen is an associate professor of American culture at the University of Michigan. I also want to thank John Terry for being here tonight from Westminster Schools in Atlanta. John, as our TA, will be in the audience chat asking questions and sharing resources. Hey, Professor, can you hear me up in Lansing, Michigan?
I can hear you, and I'm in Ann Arbor, and that difference is quite important to us up here.
That's like you telling me that I'm in Durham, not in Chapel Hill. I apologize.
Exactly. That's okay.
That's right. So I apologize for the inadvertent tweak. You are, in fact, in Ann Arbor. I lost all my credibility with our Michigan audience. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to you walking us through this conversation tonight. And with your permission, I'd like to actually open with a sort of a personal question for you to describe for us. And it's one that I think our audience, they work with students at all ages, young ages. And I wonder if you can talk to us about the difference between commemoration and memory. How do you deal with memory as an historian?
That's an excellent question. I would say that commemoration is an effort to give memory a concrete form. And memory for historians is it is elusive. It is a romantic idea. It's a little bit dangerous. Most historians spend their professional life working to find evidence that would support memory, that would help us understand people's memory. But memory is fleeting. Memory is elusive. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how important the idea of memory is to people. So that's a start of an answer.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And it's a complex one. And, you're speaking from, the highest of levels of trained expert historians in the ways that you grapple with it. And so, starting this language and starting to make these distinctions, even for young people, seems to be an important first step. Again, thank you for joining. You can control the PowerPoint at your own pace. And again, I'll bring you questions when the time's right.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for your introduction. Thank you, John, for moderating. Thank you to everyone who is listening this evening. I'm really honored to be here to be able to do this. I think as a scholar, I make a practice of trying to work with K-12 educators. I think my conversation with K-12 educators always make me better. They make me, people ask great questions. They help me hone my thinking. I was in a meeting this afternoon about a project with some students at Cass Tech High School in Detroit. So I look for these opportunities and I'm grateful to have them. So thank you to everybody. I thought I would start with just a few little notes so you have a sense of how this is going to go. I have divided this presentation into 5 parts. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but I'm going to take a little bit of time to get there, so I hope you will be patient with me. And I'm quite informal, so I really look forward to being interrupted with questions as we move through these 5 sections that I have organized my thinking in for tonight. I also, before I start, wanted to make a little bit of a note about the readings in the video that I sent along. They might seem, so I included a video that is just an introduction to a little peek into the collection of objects that are left at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I included, and that video is from 2021. And then I included 2 op-eds from 2017. One by a woman named Karen Finney, who writes about the fact that she is a relative of Robert E. Lee and she wants his memorials to come down. And the other is an op-ed by a woman named Karen Cox, who has written a great deal about Confederate memorials. And it's her op-ed makes the argument that these memorials are an effort to maintain white supremacy in the culture and that they need to come down. And it might initially seem to anybody looking at this combination of these 3 pieces of evidence that they don't quite make sense together, that the beautiful, heartfelt hand-sewn objects left at the Vietnam Memorial to express a very intimate kind of grief might not seem like they're connected to both the intimacy of the Karen Finney story about Lee and the big broad sweep of Karen Cox's story about the Confederate memorials. And I'm hoping, if I'm successful tonight, I will help us all to see how these readings are actually quite connected. That is part of what I want to do. I also included the introductions to a couple of my books. One is called Carried to the Wall, and it is a book about the objects left at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. But that introduction, just for people who are curious about the story, more details about the story of the memorial, that introduction will be of interest. And then I included the introduction to my second book, which is called Sacrificing Soldiers on the National Mall, which is about a memorial boom that was inspired by the Vietnam Memorial. So anyway, all of which is to say, I have a plan, and if I am successful, by the end of the evening, I will have achieved with this plan a couple of things. I will help put the memorial controversies of the last few years in context. I will have encouraged you all to think about monuments maybe in a slightly different way, as tools, as cultural objects that are made to be used to express ideology rather than as, some kind of eternal expressions of truth. And finally, I will have made the connection for you between angry crowds pulling down monuments and a teddy bear left at the Vietnam Memorial. And the key theme for me as we move forward, is to really frame thinking about memorials as tools and the work that they do. A quick story before, I guess I'll go to my first image because it's kind of interesting. One of the things that got me thinking about memorials in the way that I'm thinking about them now is an event that I attended. It was the National Festival of the Book in Washington, D.C., and I was on a panel. And my fellow panelists, at the end of the panel, we started talking. Somebody in the audience had a question about Silent Sam, the memorial at the University of North Carolina. And two of the panelists on the panel with me were graduates of the esteemed University of North Carolina in Durham. I know it's not in Durham.
I see what you did there. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. These historians of memorials were spending a lot of time defending Silent Sam, Confederate memorial, and talking about the way in which it was benign and the way in which they had so much nostalgia about this memorial from their experience at the school. And I was really fascinated by that because these are professional trained historians, but also their sense of how the world should work and the order of things was really connected to the idea that this figure of this young man should stand at the gates of their university. And the people who were saying to them, to me, what I see here is an act of violence, they just couldn't hear it. And for me, that was evidence of how powerfully memorials work to naturalize untruths in the culture. A memorial can do incredibly powerful work of making a lie seem like a shared truth. And when I started out as a scholar, I was interested in racism, but I wasn't ever intending to become a scholar of race. I wanted to be a scholar of patriotism. But I have come to learn that every stone I have ever unturned in my studies about patriotism, I have found thinking about race. So this image, to get us started, this image is a photograph of a replica of a chair, and some of you may remember this story from a year ago. This is a replica of a Jefferson Davis memorial that was kidnapped from a Confederate memorial in Selma, Alabama. And this chair was kidnapped by a group of people who called themselves White Lives Matter, Inc. And they took the chair, and then they created a replica, which is what you're looking at, and they carved a hole in the replica. And they threatened to use it as a toilet unless the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are responsible for the vast majority of Confederate memorials in the United States, unless they hung a banner outside their headquarters that read, "The rulers of this country have always considered their property more important than our lives." The UDC, the women of the UDC are quite smart. They did not take the bait. The people who kidnapped this memorial were eventually arrested. The memorial has been returned. There was this, I don't know what happened to the replica, but they got a lot of attention because they were, mostly because their name was clever. And they provide a really useful starting place for thinking about how lies get embedded in the landscape and why that matters. My next image is of the Strom Thurman Memorial in Columbia, South Carolina. And it's very typical of a lot of memorials in the United States. It has a kind of neoclassical feel. It echoes the architecture of the state building behind it, proud figure striding across the State House lawn. But there's a story associated with this memorial that also, for me, is very telling about how difficult it is to change the memorial landscape. So the White Lives Matter folks, they got some attention, but the Jefferson Davis Memorial is still sitting in the cemetery. And it's sitting next to a plaque that reads, "Jefferson Davis was the most honest, brave, and true of men." And that's complicated by the fact that Jefferson Davis was someone who said things like, slavery is a moral blessing. And so the lie that I'm talking about is in the tension between the idea that we can celebrate Davis unequivocally, who was the president of the Confederacy, and he used a lot of really difficult language, that we can celebrate him unequivocally and that that's not racist. Strom Thurman was a different kind of racist, of a different generation, but was a very powerful and insistent racist. And I just want to play a little clip of language from him. This is from a stump speech he gave when he was running for president in 1948.
But I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. But I want to tell you.
So what he's saying there, the key thing that I would like you to hear is, it's obviously a call for segregation. It's also a call for violence. And he talks about protecting our swimming pools. And I'm going to come back to that. So he was a complicated character. He was a complicated person. He had a daughter with a domestic who worked for his parents when this young woman was 16 years old. His mixed race daughter, he kept hidden his whole life. She came forward and sort of publicly introduced herself as his daughter after his death. And one of the things that she did was she asked that her name be added to this memorial. So in this next image here, I hope you can see it, but if you look carefully, you can see that towards the bottom, something is a mess. And his mixed race daughter, Essie Mae Washington Williams, asked her siblings, whose names are carved here. It says, initially it said the father of 4 children, and it listed the names of his children. Essie Mae Washington Williams asked that her name be added to this, which required a state law to enable it, but B, it required for the 4 to be chiseled into a 5. And for me, looking at that, it's such a powerful emblem of how hard it is to reinscribe what we have inscribed in our landscape and the stories that we have told ourselves about who we are in our landscapes. It's another example of the ways in which powerful untruths get naturalized. He was never the father of 4. He was the father of 5. And his daughter, who tried to join the Daughters of the Confederacy unsuccessfully, made the radical act of getting her name carved here. So this is a very typical early memorial from the Confederate memorial period. This is Lee. It was just recently removed from where he stood since 1890 in Richmond, Virginia. My next image is a different version of that same memorial. This is what it looked like after the protests in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd. And on the one hand, this is kind of, it's beautiful, it's jolting, it's upsetting, but it is evidence of people deciding that they need to take over the memorial, that they need to use the memorial as a tool to tell a different kind of a story. That Lee standing undisturbed in the middle of the city enabled a lie about who we are and who he was to continue to be told. This next image is another version of the repurposing of that memorial and a different group of people using the tool of the memorial to tell a very different kind of story. So all of that is to say memorials are tools, memorials are powerful, memorials are blunt instruments. And everybody, Jefferson Davis, certainly Lee, deserves a careful, nuanced study and understanding. But that's not what memorials are built to do. They are not built to convey nuance or subtlety, and they are never neutral, ever. And that's a very important thing to understand about them. So part 2, I'm going to fly here, I hope, through a history of memorials in the United States in 3 parts. And I'm going to spend most time in the part in the middle where we'll find the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but I think it's really important to have some of this background. So early Americans, although it seems strange to us now, didn't want a lot of federal symbolism. So this is a map of Pierre L'Enfant's plan in 1791 for the design of the city of Washington. And you can see this has these crazy-making radial streets of Washington, and it has a kind of blank rectangular space in the middle that would eventually become the National Mall. But L'Enfant almost got fired for proposing that they build a life-size statue of Washington and place it at the center of the memorial. He ended up getting fired because he burned down the city manager's house in the middle of the night, but that was a different story. People in 1791 were so wary of too much federal symbolism, too much attention paid to, credence given to centralized power, that the city had to be laid out in this funky way to reflect the states. All of those big avenues you see, as most of you know, are named after states, so that the capital would be defined by the relationship of the state rather than celebrating too much federal power. This started to change around 1830. And in 1830, 30 years before the Civil War, there was increasing anxiety about division in the United States, and there was an increasing desire for more federal symbols. So 40 years in, federal symbols memorialization started to seem less offensive. And in fact, people were so desperate in the 1830s that the Washington Monument, this is what you're looking at now, this is an 1833, very early photograph of the Washington Monument as it was initially, as it was started to be built. And the Washington Monument was intended in 1833 to be the tallest building ever built, and it was intended to reflect unity in the United States. This photograph reflects the way in which it failed. If next time you're in Washington, stand in front of it and you will notice that there are two different colors of stone in the memorial. And that's because when it reached this height, somebody donated a stone, the Pope donated a stone. And there was so much anti-Catholic sentiment that it ground the whole project to a halt. And it wasn't started again until after the Civil War. During the Civil War, all of the stone that was in this quarry was used in war-related activities, so they had to build it with new stone. And so it's two colors, which I always think is a way in which it reflects the failure of the Washington Monument. This is a photograph of 30 years later, in the middle of the war. This is Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. And I just want to stand on the Gettysburg Address for a minute because it's so important to understanding how we came to have a dramatic change of heart about how we understand memorial culture in the United States, how we understand celebrating federal power, and how we understand and think about our soldiers. So you all probably know the Gettysburg Address inside out. You've heard it many times. I just want to call your attention to a line in the middle. We are met on a great battlefield of war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. So he's saying we are dedicating a cemetery. He goes on to say it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, which, if you stop and think about it, by 21st century American terms is astonishing. That the President of the United States is explaining that it is appropriate for him to dedicate a military cemetery. And he's doing that because prior to Gettysburg, American soldiers who were killed in battle were buried together in mass graves that were not particularly deep. And there was no expectation that their body would be identified. Now, we have spent billions of dollars of getting every scrap of every DNA of every person who was ever in Vietnam. It's unimaginable to us now that we would simply, that there wouldn't be such a thing as a dog tag, that we would simply throw soldiers lost in battle into a mass grave. But that's what we did until Gettysburg. And so the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln is saying it's appropriate that we bury these young men. And when he goes on, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, cannot consecrate, cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. He's saying we are in the middle of the war, trying to figure out how to tell the story of who we are in the United States. We are the people who were defined by what these brave men did. It is about them. And he begins a long history in the United States that will take us to the Vietnam Memorial story of putting a high value on the sacrifice of the citizen soldier. Here is a picture of the photograph of the cemetery when it was finally completed. It's hard for us to imagine that there was a past in which soldiers were treated so differently than they are now, but that is in fact the case. This attitude that Lincoln described, kind of a way of understanding who we are as a people, changed memorial practices, and it changed burial practice in the United States. And initially after the war, the business of people commemorating soldiers was really just about burying the dead or properly burying the dead. 30 years out from the war, a movement to build memorials kicked off. And we had the first memorial boom in the United States that stretched from 1890 to 1920. And the vast majority of American memorials were built in this period. Most of them were Confederate memorials. Most of them were built by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Some of them look like this. This is the restored chair, Jefferson Davis chair in Selma, Alabama. Some of them look like this, and most of them look like this. And this is a photograph of Silent Sam in North Carolina. It's important to think about all of these memorials, as I have said, as tools. And then it's important to stop and think, what were the work they were, each memorial was trying to do as a tool? How was it being used? And the best way, and a great assignment, is to ask students to look up the dedication speeches given at any memorial, because people who built them were quite proud that they had built them. They had something important that they really wanted to say, and they stood up at the memorial dedications and said it. And this, at the dedication to this memorial, which my colleagues had described as benign and about which they were so sentimental, Julian Carr, one of the speakers, stood up, and this is what he said. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days, perhaps after my return from the war, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where there was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed the pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights after slept with a double-barreled shotgun next to my bed. He slept with a shotgun next to his bed because he brutally beat a woman in front of an entire garrison of soldiers. But he is delighted in telling the story because no harm came to him. He is celebrating the triumph of the lost cause, which is the ideology that the Civil War memorials worked so successfully to express. The idea that the Civil War was a war fought by valiant young men who were not racist, not really so concerned about slavery, but who were defending a way of life. And the lost cause has a very sentimental approach to these young men. The lost cause, lots of the arguments that you see about these memorials reflect on the idea that these are memorials created by the mothers for their sons. But in fact, they came much later. The mothers didn't survive to see these memorials, and they weren't produced for the most part by the mothers or the widows. They were produced by people who had a very particular political point of view. Memorials in the North to the Civil War mostly were Lincoln memorials in one shape or another, but they also didn't escape the racial violence, the racial tone of some of the Confederate memorials. So this is the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., which, as you can see, celebrates emancipation in a complicated way. Part of what happened during this memorial boom was the National Mall, which L'Enfant had designed in that earlier map I showed you, had a spot for it, but it had been neglected. The lack of interest in memorials other than the Washington, which was completed and then sort of surrounded by a lot of rubble. There were makeshift hospitals during the war. Before the war, there was a site where people were sold, slaves were sold. It was kind of a mess. And during this period of the memorial boom, Senator McMillan, a Michigan senator, I will say, had the idea that that the mall needed, we needed to reflect this memorial boom. We needed to bring order to the mall. And so this is the new plan that was developed that includes the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial. And here is the Lincoln Memorial. And next time you're there, you will see that on one side, he is flanked by the language of the second inaugural address, which is quite violent and takes the violence of slavery quite seriously. And on the other side, he's flanked by the language of the Gettysburg Address, that language of it's altogether proper and fitting that we should do this, and that we are defined by the soldiers who sacrificed their lives here. So after the memorial, this memorial boom, just at the end, Americans fought in the First World War. And there was some figural sculpture. This figure is a little bit, this is a doughboy. He's kind of similar to the figure of Silent Sam, although it's a very different politics, probably produced in the same foundry. Most of these were produced in the Northeast by Italian immigrants. But there was some of this kind of memorial, but most memorials after the memorial boom, which again did not immediately follow the Civil War, right? People after the memorial boom lost interest in memorials. So from 1920, 1919 to 1980, memorials went out of style. Even though this period saw 100,000 deaths from the First World War, 400,000 deaths from the Second World War, 60 roughly thousand deaths from the Korean War, and 60 roughly thousand deaths from the Vietnam War, there was very little interest in war memorials in this period. And most of the memorials that were built in this period were in fact living memorials. Highways, swimming pools. And this is where we're coming back to Strom, Thurman, and his mention of the swimming pools. These were completely race neutral, these memorials. World War II veterans wanted to build the infrastructure for which they had sacrificed for the next generation. It's a beautiful way to memorialize what they contributed. But because the culture was not race neutral, these places were not race neutral. And there was some other memorial culture that was produced in this period. This is one in the Roosevelt Statue in front of the Natural History Museum in New York City has been in the news a lot lately because it has a pretty toxic racial narrative to tell. An indigenous man who is essentially naked, Roosevelt on a horse, and a black man who is also essentially naked. So in that middle period, some memorial stuff, but really much less interest in memorials. Memorials went out of style. Memorials from until 1980, from basically 1920 to 1980, there was very little interest in memorials. They went out of style. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial changed that. It really changed everything. It made memorials matter again. So this mall, which was essentially unchanged, this plan for the mall from its completion in 1920 until the dedication of the Vietnam Memorial, was to change pretty dramatically after the building of the wall. So here is a photograph of Jan Scruggs and Maya Lin. Jan Scruggs was a Vietnam veteran. His father had served in the Second World War. His father had come home from the Second World War, and like World War II veterans, he had inherited the earth. He bought a house on the GI Bill. He got educated on the GI Bill. He was able to support his family well. And Jan Scruggs came back from Vietnam and received nothing like that. No parade, no celebration of his service. He went to see the movie The Deer Hunter, which is a brutal movie if any of you have seen it, and came out of the movie convinced that he needed to do something for veterans, that he needed to change the social position of veterans. He was in college. He went back to school after his service, and he was studying the collective unconscious and Carl Jung, and he had the idea that we needed to build a memorial to remember Vietnam veterans. And memorials were so out of style that he got an incredible site on the National Mall. He got a design competition through all of the bodies that need to approve these things, and he got it built between 1979 and 1982. Just for a point of reference, in 1982, conversations about the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. started, and that memorial was dedicated in 2004. So, and Maya Lin, this for teachers, this is always the kind of nightmare. She got a B on this project from her teacher. It was an assignment in a funerary architecture class at Yale University. All of the students had to submit something for this wide open design competition, and her design won. Unlike the neoclassical architecture that dominates Washington, that really dominates all memorial culture in the United States, vast majority of it before this memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is kind of anti-neoclassical. Black granite carved with names. Here you can see it's reflecting the Washington monuments, not triumphal, it's not celebratory. When you are standing where this photographer was standing, you are literally buried 6 feet under. You are in the ground with these men, 6 women, and 58,000 men. Here is an aerial view. The photographer is either it's a drone or they're standing on top of the Lincoln Memorial, but they are right there on the mall. You can see the memorial. Here you can see, I can't point, but if you can see close to the river, there's the circle where the Lincoln Memorial is, and just north of that is the location of the Vietnam Memorial. The memorial is carved with the names of those who died, those who were missing in action, and those who prisoners of war who never returned. One of the decisions that Maya Lin made that was so effective was most memorials. She was studying French war memorials that are lists of names carved on neoclassical sculptures in alphabetical order. She decided that the names should be listed in the order in which these men died, so that people who died together their names were together, and so that it wasn't Hernandez, 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 but that it was Whitaker and Cunningham and Giles and Hill all mixed together. That was incredibly effective design idea. This memorial is now so beloved. It's one of the most visited sites in the United States. It was not immediately beloved. It was quite controversial. In fact, Maya Lin's design, which is the black wall, couldn't get approval from the Department of the Interior. Ronald Reagan held it up because there were a lot of people who were unhappy that the memorial was not celebratory or heroic. So these figures were added to add a celebratory, masculine, and heroic element. And here is a close-up shot. The most remarkable thing about this memorial has been how people have responded to it. Now, when there is a tragedy, a car crash, a big national tragedy, a shooting, people bring their stuff. This was not a thing in the United States before the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. People did not carry teddy bears to scenes of tragedy. And even before the memorial was dedicated, people started bringing their objects. They started bringing, somebody brought a Medal of Honor and asked the construction crew if he could throw his brother's Medal of Honor into the concrete as they were pouring the foundations. People just started bringing their stuff. I believe that people started bringing their stuff because the people who were asked to fight and die in this war, many, many of them came from populations that had traditions of grave decoration. African Americans, Italian American Catholics, Irish American Catholics, Mexican American Catholics, Puerto Rican Catholics, Native Indigenous folks have traditions of using objects to mitigate the passage of death. So all of these, many of the people whose names are on the wall came from communities where these were important practices, and they brought these practices to this public space for the first time. And I have spent a lot of time in the warehouse with these objects, and it never stops being heartbreaking. What people carry.
Professor?
Yes.
Professor, can I ask you, so I have the very real privilege and distinction of growing up in the East and growing up in Virginia and having spent a lot of time in DC and around the sites that you're mentioning. I'm not sure if our audience knows how these are indexed. Do you mind clarifying? You just said that you spent a lot of time in the warehouse. Can you tell us more about that warehouse for those who don't know that?
So on the first day of the dedication, people started leaving things. And the Park Service, which is in charge of the memorial, really didn't know what to do, but people were leaving precious things like the, what's in this image, or dog tags. And these dog tags, and I've done research on these dog tags, some of them are from Vietnam, some of them are from later, but they're dog tags that identified real people, sort of referencing us back to Gettysburg and the beginning of the need for dog tags. So the Park Service understood that these things should not be thrown away, but they really didn't know what to do. So they just started to collect them. And now they have a very organized scheme where every morning they clear the objects that were left from the night before, and at the end of the day, every day they clear the objects, and they store them in a warehouse in Maryland. And this next image is just a few of the things being processed to go into the storage. These are some cranes you can see. This is a Christmas gift wrapped. This is a cross. People leave letters and photographs. And so all of these things are stored in this warehouse in Maryland. And the idea was eventually that a museum was going to be opened to display all of this. But that's been controversial. Some of these, people didn't necessarily leave this stuff for it to be displayed in a museum. People left it for all kinds of reasons, but a lot of it seems very intimate and very private. This picture kills me, that little duck looking out from inside this storage locker, baseball there. The things, I think the number one thing that people leave is a can of Budweiser, often with a note saying, when we were in Vietnam, I promised I'd buy you beer when I came back. Here it is. But every kind of thing. I was in an event not too long ago at the National Archive, and a couple of us were talking about these objects, and somebody put up on a screen a photograph of a very worn, rumpled, much folded piece of paper, and it was a list of the names of all of the men who had died on this one soldier's watch during his time in Vietnam. And he kept a list of all of the soldiers who died, and he carried that list with him in his wallet for the rest of his life. And after he died, his daughter left it at the memorial, and it became part of the collection. And then at this event, we showed the slide, and a woman came up from the audience and said, my dad's name was on that list. So that just broke my heart. I mean, I just thought it was wonderful that she would be carrying this, that she would now know that somebody literally carried her father for the rest of his life. But it's just an incredible collection of objects that are all kind of about people engaging with the memorial, people using the memorial, people owning and making the memorial their own thing. And that's how I think this collection really connects to, even though it may seem like a strange connection, the Confederate memorials were built to tell a particular kind of story. This is a different way of using them, but it's very powerful. Andy,
Professor,
that Bing wasn't. Yes.
No, that Bing, I apologize. I unmuted myself to ask you a question, and then my second computer Bing. That was just a random occurrence. But I think you're giving all of us chills. And I've been to the wall many times, and what you're describing is spot on. And in some ways, it reminds me of the interactivity or the portal that cemeteries provide. Would you call the Vietnam Wall, Memorial Wall, a cemetery in terms of its practice and its function?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have treated it as a gravesite for their son or their husband. And a lot of these traditions of bringing objects, I'm Irish Catholic from San Francisco. When we buried my great aunt, who was a nun, we put a cup of coffee and a radio on her grave because she loved the Giants and listened to them on the transistor radio, and she loved her coffee. So people have these traditions, and I think because the social position of the soldier in the United States was so disrupted after the Vietnam War, because people came back one at a time after their year-long stint, there wasn't a place, no matter how you felt about the deeply unpopular war, for collective mourning, and bringing the objects activated that, and it enabled this kind of collective mourning. And so, yeah, I do think, people would actually take a photograph of the actual cemetery, the headstone where somebody is buried, and then bring the photograph to the memorial and leave it at the memorial, which I think is fascinating. And I'd be happy to answer questions. I could talk about this for a week, the kinds of things that people leave: bras, wedding rings, a bottle of aftershave. Somehow that one really sticks with me. Like, this is what he smelled like. It's worth remembering. And that takes me right back to Lincoln at Gettysburg. Like, we are defined by these people who sacrificed for us, and we need to remember who they are.
Let's take just a pause then for some questions, and I actually am going to invite you to maybe even linger on that thought a little bit more, in terms of this as a memorial being, you talked a lot about memorials falling out of fashion and not being, at least at a national level, not being embraced as much, and then this sort of kick-started that again. Is it because, or can you comment on the role of this engagement and interactivity, but also in the context of a very controversial period of American history, the 1960s, the Vietnam War? In some ways, did this memorial sort of serve as a therapeutic outlet for that agitation?
Yeah, I think it did. One of the key things to understand about memorials is people don't build memorials in the halcyon days. When things are great, you don't need the memorial, right? That's why we needed them from 1890 to 1920, period of massive disruption on all these levels. And then the period after the Vietnam War was a period of intense disruption. And so people build memorials or tear them down in periods of social disruption. And Jan Scruggs just had the insight, maybe a memorial would help. Maybe a memorial would be healing. And, I think it was pretty good insight.
Yeah. This question comes from Raquel. Raquel is joining us from Los Angeles, California. Raquel asked this: could it be that people started to bring objects because the memorial was so abstract that they wanted to make a connection with something more concrete and tangible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think so, although I think it really had more to do with the specificity of memory, the name. So maybe obviously the name is not enough. Whatever the memorial offered, it felt like an invitation for more rather than something that was complete. I have always thought about it in terms of people wanting a more granular level of remembrance rather than an issue of abstraction. And I think the neoclassical forms, they don't really invite participation. People really, until they started spray painting Lee monuments and knocking down Columbus, people really didn't participate with the neoclassical memorials. So maybe you're right. Maybe it's the sort of abstraction opened up the invitation for more engagement, and people jumped right in. And I will say, when I was doing my research, I was staying with a friend who was from Puerto Rico, and she said, kind of in an offhand way, well, Puerto Ricans won't leave anything. Almost as if it was a point of pride. And I thought, I wonder what's that about? And I started to look. And of course, I discovered that Puerto Ricans left all kinds of things, then I started looking at other Catholic traditions. And I did start to be able to kind of make some connections to, okay, people are drawing on traditions that they already have, and they're bringing them to this new site.
Right. And what's interesting is that, there's a certain number of people who can engage with the wall personally and directly because of the name and the relationship to that name. But the wall is the wall is also very powerful for those of us who don't have someone whose name is on that wall, and almost an eavesdropping, a Sonder kind of experience where you can witness and be empathetic for and really connect with the connection, the experience of those who are represented. But it's not in any way exclusive of those of us who don't have a name on the wall to claim.
No, in fact, lots of the things that get left are left by people who didn't know anybody, who only felt, they mourned the loss of their fellow Americans, and they mourned the disruption that the war created, and they mourned kind of what the war did to patriotism in the United States, all kinds of things. But yeah, lots of people who have no connection continue to leave things. And I would say that the people who started collecting this stuff, they sort of thought, well, 2 or 3 years, people will stop leaving things. And
right.
The memorial was dedicated in 1982, and people continue every day to leave
Absolutely.
things, and not just a flag, but intimate, like the duck that's on the screen, intimate things that are, continue to be so moving.
Next question comes from Sean. Sean's a great teacher in Los Angeles. Sean asks, how do the personalization of memorials by such offerings transform the national view they were typically referenced in mass media, for example?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, I sound so teacherly going back to Lincoln at Gettysburg, but I think that the intimate actually became a national expression as we move from burying our soldiers in open pits. When people got off the trains in Gettysburg to find their sons, right, which is a new thing, they found hogs eating their, so we went from that to, we need to bring their body home. We need to give them a proper burial. They need to wear a dog tag. We need to build the infrastructure, in the living memorials for the future as a way to remember, to a very kind of intimate expectation at the national level of how we are going to remember sacrifice. And the wall inspired all kinds of local memorials where people leave things. So it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Meg is joining us from Brazil tonight, São Paulo, Brazil. I'm going to give her this question. She's noting that there's a very interesting tension between formal memorial and informal. She thinks, for example, of the Lee statue with the graffiti and the Vietnam memorial with the offerings as you've described tonight. She wonders if you have anything to say on the topic of official and formal versus informal and individual. And in fact, I'm going to add just a little side note to her question and ask, does it make it more reverent and more accepted? I think it'd be much harder to start pulling down. I don't think anybody would go and pull down someone's personal things, whereas some of the statues that you've described tonight, Silent Sam and Jefferson, Charlottesville, et cetera, that has almost a third person feeling that doesn't invite the same kind of reflection. But it would be very hard to go in and I've never heard of anybody going to the Vietnam Wall and kicking through all this stuff and kind of getting rid of it, right? So talk to us about informal versus official.
I love that question because partly what I wanted to do this evening was to mess with that line between the official and the informal. The people who built the big neoclassical, formal-looking memorials built them in a time of disruption. They built them to make a very particular political point about the lost cause, and they were hugely successful. The lost cause won, and the formality of them was part of the sort of magic of the tool, the success of the tool of a memorial. Made the argument that this is an internal truth, that this is neutral, that this is just how it is. And I think Maya Lin's design actually is quite formal, the design, but the open quality of it and the fact that it wasn't neoclassical, it wasn't the sort of regular architecture of power in the United States, and the fact that people were in a moment of speaking truth to power or, feeling rebellious. Vietnam veterans are not famous for towing the line, right? That people, when people started bringing things, they were less impressed, maybe, some combination. And I don't know how you actually know any of this definitively, but I think some combination of the fact that it wasn't a neoclassical design, that the names were part of a kind of particular memory, and that the people who organized the memorial encouraged, once people started leaving things, they wanted people to continue to leave things. So for instance, at the World War II Memorial in Washington, you are actively discouraged on the website, at the memorial, from leaving anything. They do not want you to leave anything, and they will tell you that's not the kind of memorial this is. We don't, and they will say Vietnam veterans have issues that World War II veterans do not, which of course is an absurdity.
Professor,
I don't know
that
if
actually
that
leads.
Your question. Yeah.
Well, it does, and it actually leads really well to the next question. Then I've got one more short question, and then I'm going to remind us we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to invite you to move forward with the conclusion. But this next question comes from Carolyn, wonderful retired public school educator, Carolyn. And she wonders if you'd say more about this idea that World War II veterans inherited the earth. Does that mean that memorials weren't needed because of how they being the veterans were received when they returned?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. They didn't perceive that they needed them. When veterans returned from World War II, they were victorious. They were celebrated. The celebration that and the sort of the adulation that they got didn't necessarily match with their experience of the war. The United States after the war had our gross national product was roughly equivalent to that of every other country on the planet. We were in this moment of ascension. And World War II veterans were very clear. They didn't want symbolic stones. They wanted basketball courts. They wanted swimming pools. And it's a beautiful way to memorialize that generation of soldiers. But they were quite explicit that they didn't need it, they didn't want it, and they wanted to go look forward. And there certainly, we had huge losses. It was just, a devastating war. But after the war, people wanted to move forward and enjoy the fruits of the labor of those we lost.
Great. One last quick question before we move on. This question comes from Monica. Monica's in Durham, nearby Durham. She's wondering if we know who the very first person was who organically left something at the wall. Who started this?
Yeah, we don't know. The story that everyone tells, everyone and people associated with this collection have a lot of, they believe in that there's a power of the wall, like that story I told about the woman. Of course, the woman, in their mind, of course, the woman whose father was named on that list would be in the audience that night. The story that gets told is the story about the brother who brought his brother who didn't survive Medal of Honor to throw in the foundation. But because nobody was expecting it, because nothing like this had ever happened before, there aren't good records kept. So it's sort of lore at the beginning.
Great, thank you. Well, Professor, we have just about 10 or 12 minutes left before some final questions. Why don't you move through the remaining slides, and then we'll bring those questions to you at that point.
Okay. So the Vietnam Memorial, I said the Vietnam Memorial changed everything. It changed, it created this practice of bringing things, Ground Zero, Columbine, I've mentioned that it created this practice that we're so familiar with now. It also inspired a second memorial boom. Pentagon officials, people in the Department of Defense were very concerned, I'm going to go back just very quickly, that middle school children getting off a bus coming to the Capitol in an era of an all-volunteer military were going to see this and this. They were going to come to the Capitol and they were going to learn that dying in an American war is tragic rather than heroic. And so memorial building boom ensued. The Korean War Veterans Memorial was built in 1995. It was dedicated. And when I started to do research on this, I thought, seems like they built it as a corrective to the Vietnam Memorial. This emphasizes the heroism of these soldiers. It doesn't emphasize the grief. And the first page, when you study memorials, you spend a lot of time reading the minutes of meetings where people debated memorials. And I know some of you are thinking, that sounds like the most boring thing you could possibly. Turns out, somebody finds it fascinating. Me. Anyway, this memorial was built the first thing I read on the first document of the first meeting was, we have to fix what's wrong with Vietnam Memorial. This memorial was also turned out to be very much a memorial that was a story about race. And again, I didn't start studying memorials to study race everywhere. I called Frank Gaylord, who was the sculptor of this, and I introduced myself. I'm a scholar. I'm doing this, Do you have time to talk to me? And before I could even ask him a question, he started yelling at me. He was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, really interesting guy. And he's cursing. The first soldier is white. I have a broad nose. I'm white. The first soldier is white. So we don't have time to get into it, but there were years of fights about how to racialize these soldiers in our first desegregated war. And the sculptor told me, and many other people concurred, that if he hadn't put the helmets on these figures to hide their hair, which is hard to mask racially, it would never have been built. The next memorial that was part of the boom never got built. It was a proposed Black Revolutionary War Patriots Memorial to the 5,000 people of African descent who served in the Revolutionary War. This is a crazy story, but essentially they got space on the mall, but they were told it could only be knee high. So they had a really hard time fundraising for a memorial with a bunch of Lilliputian figures. This memorial is part of this memorial boom. It is the National Memorial for Women in Military Service. Again, people inspired by the popularity of the Vietnam Memorial in some cases, and in some cases inspired by the need to correct it. This one reflects both. To me, the most fascinating thing about this memorial is that it was paid for in large part by the governments of, you would never guess this, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Why are they paying for our women's memorial? Because nobody in the United States would pay for it, and they came up with a price per head for women who served in the first Gulf War. This is a figure from the Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism during World War II, part of this second memorial boom. This is a crane, Japanese symbol, wrapped in barbed wire. And here is the World War II memorial, which, as I said, they started to talk about in 1992 and was dedicated in 2004. And this memorial is, this memorial is clearly a response to the Vietnam Memorial. It's everything that the Vietnam Memorial is not. It's celebratory, it's heroic. You go there and you feel great about the war, and you are not allowed to leave any objects. Anything that you leave there will be disposed of. And I only have, I know, a very few minutes, but this, so this is the second memorial boom. The National Mall was transformed by the felt need to fix what was wrong with the Vietnam Memorial. And memorials, there wasn't a whole lot of activity returning back to the present in the last 15 years until people started talking about bringing memorials down. We embraced memorials again, and now we want many of them to have new meanings. So people, I don't know, I hope that you can see this image in a slightly different way than you saw it at the beginning. A lot of conversations that people have about memorials are as if they are only one thing, which is the static, neutral, eternal truth, when in fact, they are always being changed, always controversial, always being messed with. And this is Columbus toppled in Minnesota. And I want to end with this image, which is a new memorial that has gone up in Richmond, Virginia, just down the street from where Robert E. Lee stood for so long in a similar pose. And this is on the grounds of the museum there. And it is a work by Kehinde Wiley, and it's titled Rumors of War. And I love this because it brings together kind of many of the themes that I've been talking about. This is the old form remade. It's not spray paint on Robert E. Lee, but it's actually a memorial inspired by a particular monument to Jeb Stuart. Only this person on the horse is a young man, African-American man. He's wearing Nikes. He's got dreadlocks. The title of the piece is A Rumor of War, and he is looking warily over his shoulder. So it's the old tool, this form of monument, used to make a very new point. And I think the last thing I'll say before we have time for a few questions is I love teaching this stuff to young people because it pulls back the curtain on how the world gets made. Somebody decides to build a memorial and tell an eternal truth, and they put that memorial in place and they're telling an eternal truth, even if it's a complete lie. And the culture is made by the people who step up and make things and participate, whether that's bringing an object to the memorial or spray painting something or building a new form. So I'll stop so we can have more questions. I hope this has been of use to you.
Thank you, Professor. This has really been a lovely conversation. The audience chat has really been full of interesting insights and reflections, and I've got some questions to bring to you before we conclude tonight. Let me start by asking you to talk a little bit more about the difference between, in the context of memorials, the difference between public and private funding. How are these, and it seems like as you've walked through this full slide deck that there's been an evolution of private into public. So what's the difference there?
Well, most memorials have been privately funded. So the Confederate memorials were funded by the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, for the most part. And during the second memorial boom, it was a point of pride for the Vietnam veterans that as they said, that the government that sent them to serve in the war, they didn't want them to have anything to do with the memorial. They wanted to pay for it themselves. And that set a template. So although the World War II memorial was mostly paid for by private donations, there was some federal money in there, and of course they're on federal land. But in fact, most of these memorials, and it's a really important point, I'm glad somebody asked the question, they're on public land. They are defining who we are for all of us, but they are almost always private endeavors.
Professor, are you there?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. I think I glitched just a little bit there. Thank you. Next question comes from Pamela. Pamela is joining us from Georgia. She's wondering if you can clarify the use of the term memorial versus monument.
Thank you for that great question. After many years of fiddling with this, I have concluded there's no useful distinction. People who build them, people who study them, in some ways, a memorial, that language seems like it would indicate something that was more about having to do with mourning and remembering the dead. But in practice, both terms are used all over the place. So it's an unsatisfying answer. I apologize, but I think that's the true answer.
Right. This question comes from John. John is in Southern California. He wonders if memorials and the heroism that they imply, or the celebration, the commemoration that we infer from them, make our society more willing to go to war. Are memorials used to encourage participation in warfare?
Yes. Yes, they are. Not always, but yes, they are. That's why the Veterans Organization for Korean War veterans is called the Graybeards, because Korean War veterans did not have a national, a lot of local organizations. They didn't really feel very identified as a veterans group. They were created by the group that was trying to build the Korean War Memorial, because people in the Department of Defense were so concerned about the Vietnam Memorial discouraging these young people coming to the mall from participating, especially, again, in the context of an all-volunteer military, that all of these other memorials were built in part, especially the Korean Memorial and the World War II Memorial, to explicitly to encourage military participation. And that's all over the language of these meetings about these memorials.
Great, thank you. Last question, Professor. We've got so many educators tonight in the audience from all over the country. Again, they don't have the ease, at least, of seeing some of these East Coast-based monuments and memorials. Do you have any advice on how educators can work with younger students to view and analyze and have these conversations if they have to visit them virtually? Being there in person is super powerful, but what if you can't go there?
Yeah, I mean, I find, you know, especially with the Vietnam Memorial, the images can be so gripping of these objects. I find that using images with them can be quite powerful. I also think actually, you know, looking at the local memorials and having students look up the speeches that somebody gave at the dedication to the Yunipio Cerro Memorial or the Columbus Memorial in your town, or the whatever the, you know, local Vietnam Memorial is, and seeing kind of what people said, what they intended. I think the local memorials pretty much follow the trend of the national memorial, and they can be just as useful to study.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And Professor, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and your experiences with us tonight. The several audience chat members noted that they could have done this webinar twice as long, but unfortunately we don't have that amount of time. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you all. It's really been a pleasure, and I thank you for putting my book up here. This book is coming out in the fall, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to talk to you.
As I mentioned to our audience, this is the last webinar of this year's webinar series. We already have next year's series slated and scheduled, though, and I'm going to ask you to put a little note in your iCal to check in on August the 15th at 10 a.m. East Coast time, when we'll open the registration for the 2022-23 webinar series schedule. We've got 42 episodes slated. That starts on August 30th with Dustin Carnahan, who will be sharing his work on misinformation, conspiracy theories, and extremism. And then throughout the year, we'll have a wide variety of topics on global studies, on multicultural lenses and perspectives, on different aspects of the humanities, both history, literature, philosophy, religion, music. We're going to be covering it all. So I do hope that you're able to join us, and I do hope that you share your experiences and the value with your colleagues, your departments, and your networks. You can also follow our social media feed for any upcoming activities. Hey, don't forget, if you want to come and join us in Durham for a week, applications are due next Friday, May the 13th, for the Teaching African American Studies Institute. We would love to have all of you apply and potentially join us. And I want to thank you once again for being with us for so many times this year. I counted up the registrations tonight. We had about 23,000 registrations this year. And I'm extremely pleased and honored and privileged to be able to work with you on a weekly basis to have these conversations. And I hope that you found it relevant and helpful. Have a wonderful end to your school year. Have a great summer. Please get away from things. Don't check your email. But when you're ready to turn back to your curriculum, you're ready to turn back to your teaching, please return to the National Humanities Center and let us know how we can help. Hey, have a great year, everyone. It's been a pleasure to work with you. Good night.